You wake up believing you live in the future, a world of technology, progress, and stability. A world where humanity has learned from its past mistakes and finally built something better. You assume the system around you is modern, advanced, fair, but what if it isn't? What if the world you live in is just a polished version of something ancient, something designed long before you existed? Because behind every digital payment you make, every stock market surge, every new innovation that promises to change your life, there is a structure older than most countries on Earth. A structure built on the same ideas that powered empires, controlled kingdoms, and shaped civilizations. In the past, rulers used armies to expand their power. Today, modern empires use money silent, invisible, and far more effective. And while the world believes it's advancing, the same cycle repeats. Debt, growth, collapse, reset. Century after century. This isn't progress. This is repetition disguised as evolution. Because the system didn't change, only the tools did. Which leaves one question hanging in the air. If the game is the same, one humanity has been trapped in for centuries, then who are the players controlling it now? Governments like to pretend the economy is powered by productivity, innovation, hard work, but beneath every chart, every budget, every promise delivered on a podium, there's something far more fundamental, something far more fragile: debt. Not as a temporary tool, not as a last resort, but as the engine that keeps the entire world turning. Every modern country borrows. Not once, not occasionally, endlessly. When tax revenue falls short, they borrow. When crises erupt, they borrow. When elections come, they borrow even more. And the strangest part? No one questions it. We've all been trained to see this as normal, as if nations surviving on loans forever is simply how life works, like oxygen or gravity. But imagine for a moment what this really means. Every school built, every road paved, every war fought, every bailout announced, comes from money that doesn't yet exist. Money conjured through promises of future payment. Money created out of nothing but trust, trust that taxpayers decades from now will somehow cover today's decisions. Debt isn't the emergency. Debt is the fuel. And the world keeps burning more of it every year. Normal. Until you see where the money actually comes from. In the late 1600s, England was broke. War had drained the treasury, taxes were failing, and traditional lenders refused to help a king who had already defaulted before. Governments panicked. Merchants hesitated. The empire trembled. And then came a Scottish merchant with a failure-stained resume and a dangerous idea. William Paterson. Paterson didn't offer gold. He didn't offer credit. He offered something far more powerful. A new kind of debt. His proposal to King William III in 1694 was simple, but terrifyingly brilliant. A group of wealthy merchants would lend the government £1.2 million, an enormous sum. But the principal would never be repaid. Not next year. Not next decade. Not ever. Instead, the government would pay interest forever. A permanent stream of money flowing upward for as long as England existed. In exchange, Paterson would create an institution to manage this new arrangement. The Bank of England. The first central bank in the world. This was the birth of permanent national debt. The moment taxes stopped funding the nation and started funding the interest on a loan that would never die. Paterson didn't just save a king. He reinvented the relationship between governments and money. He proved debt could be eternal and profitable. One man turned taxes into an eternal payment stream, and the world copied him. Paterson's invention didn't just reshape England, it unlocked a trick that would redefine money itself. Because once the government owed a permanent debt, something unusual happened. That debt became valuable. It wasn't just a burden. It wasn't just a promise. It was an asset. The Bank of England began issuing paper notes backed not by gold, not by silver, but by the government's eternal IOU. For the first time in history, money was created from debt, literally born from a promise that would never be fulfilled. Merchants deposited gold into the bank. The bank loaned that gold to the government. The government paid interest. And then the bank issued paper notes, pieces of currency, based on that same loan. One pile of gold now generated two parallel streams of value. Real money for the government, and tradable paper money for the public. People began using those notes in markets and towns as if they were gold. Why? Because the government's permanent debt became the guarantee behind the currency itself. The more the government borrowed, the more notes the bank could issue. The more notes they issued, the more the economy grew. Debt had transformed from a desperate act into a money-making machine. But Paterson was only the first architect. Others would weaponize his idea. By the early 1800s, Europe was on fire. Wars raged, empires rose and fell, and nations needed money faster than taxes or treasuries could supply it. Into this chaos stepped a man whose family name would become synonymous with power, Nathan Rothschild. Where Paterson invented permanent national debt, Rothschild globalized it. He didn't operate in one city or one kingdom. His family built a network across 5 financial capitals: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples. A web no government could match. And through this web, he transformed sovereign debt into a cross-border industry. Instead of simply lending money directly to governments, Nathan Rothschild pioneered a new model. He bought their bonds at a discount, then resold them to investors across Europe. In days when news traveled by horses and ships, Rothschild's courier network moved with lightning precision. He could shift millions before kings even knew what happened. The effect was revolutionary. Suddenly, a default in France could bankrupt investors in Austria. A war in Spain could shake banks in London. Debt was no longer a national affair. It was a continental bloodstream, flowing through countries, institutions, and families who never met the rulers signing the contracts. Nations discovered a brutal truth. Once your debt becomes global, you cannot escape it. He didn't just lend money, he rewired nations. In 1815, Europe held its breath. The fate of the continent depended on a single battle, Waterloo. Armies clashed, empires trembled, and every government waited desperately for news. But while generals fought on muddy fields, another war was unfolding in silence inside the bond markets of London. Nathan Rothschild had something no king, no minister, no army possessed: speed. His private courier network was the fastest information system in Europe. Faster than official military messengers, faster than government channels, faster than anyone. On the day Napoleon fell, Rothschild knew before the British government itself, and he used that knowledge the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. He walked into the London Exchange and began, quietly, selling British bonds. Investors panicked. They assumed Britain had lost the war. Prices collapsed. Then, at the exact moment fear reached its peak, Rothschild reversed course and bought everything. When the official news of Napoleon's defeat arrived the next day, bond prices exploded upward. Rothschild had already filled his vaults at the lowest prices in history. This wasn't just a clever trade. It was a demonstration of a new kind of power, the power to move nations by controlling information. From this moment on, markets were ruled by those who knew first. By the mid-1800s, Europe had entered a new financial reality, one far more fragile than any monarch understood. Debt had spread across borders, across banks, across entire economies. A British bond might be held by a French investor, sold to a German banker, pledged as collateral in Austria, and used to fund a railway in Italy. One loan, powering an entire web. This was the moment sovereign debt became too interconnected to fail. If a nation defaulted now, it wasn't a simple matter of disappointing a single creditor. It meant collapsing pension funds, crippling banks, shutting down trade networks, triggering panic across continents. The world had quietly stepped into a trap. Governments had to keep paying their debt, not because they were responsible, but because default would drag everyone else down with them. No country could escape without pulling others into the abyss. And in a global system where every bond was connected to another, even a small collapse could create a chain reaction powerful enough to shake the world. Debt had grown too big, too widespread, too integrated. The old reset button default no longer existed. And then America entered the game. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was rising fast, industrial power booming, immigration surging, cities multiplying. But behind the excitement, the country had a problem no nation wants to admit. Its financial system was dangerously primitive. Thousands of banks operated independently, each issuing their own notes, each vulnerable to panic. There was no central authority, no stabilizer, no mechanism to step in when fear spread faster than money could move. And then came the panic of 1907. Markets collapsed. Banks failed. Crowds gathered outside vaults demanding withdrawals that no bank could meet. The economy was moments away from seizure. And into this chaos stepped a man whose name still echoes through Wall Street, J.P. Morgan. Morgan was not a politician, not an elected leader. But in that moment, he became something far more powerful. He locked the leading bankers of New York inside his private library, refusing to let them leave until each one pledged enormous sums to rescue failing banks. He orchestrated a private bailout so vast, so coordinated, that it stabilized the nation when the government itself could do nothing. For the first time in American history, a single banker acted as the country's central bank. But Morgan didn't want to be the hero. He wanted a permanent lever, a system that would give the financial elite control not just in crises, but forever. 3 years after the Panic of 1907, America was desperate for a solution, some way to prevent the next financial collapse. Politicians argued, newspapers speculated, citizens feared another crisis. But while the nation looked outward, the real plan was being written in secret. In November 1910, under the cover of night, a small group of powerful men boarded a private train leaving New Jersey. They used fake names, traveled with no reporters, told even their families they were on a simple hunting trip. Their destination, Jekyll Island, a remote, privately owned island off the coast of Georgia. Their mission, nothing less than designing America's monetary future. Inside a secluded mansion, over 9 days, bankers and senators drafted a blueprint for a new institution. Not a traditional bank, not a government agency, something in between. An entity that looked public, but was guided by private banks. An institution that appeared decentralized, but concentrated power in New York. A system that promised stability, but guaranteed dependence. This blueprint would soon be passed into law as the Federal Reserve System. It would control interest rates, control money creation, control the financial heartbeat of the most powerful nation on earth. They weren't designing a bank. They were designing the future. When the Federal Reserve opened its doors in 1914, most Americans had no idea what had just been created. A new kind of institution, private in structure, public in appearance, now had the power to do something no bank in history had ever been allowed to do. It could create money out of nothing. Here's how it worked. When the U.S. government needed funds, it issued bonds, IOUs, promising future payment. In the past, banks could only buy those bonds with money they already had. But the Federal Reserve changed the rules. Now, the Fed could buy government bonds using money it simply invented, typed into existence, created with a keystroke. The moment the Fed purchased a bond, new dollars appeared in the system. The government received the money it needed. And the debt now sitting on the Fed's balance sheet continued accumulating interest paid by taxpayers. For the first time, there was no natural limit to how much a government could borrow. No ceiling, no boundary, no restraint. The more the government borrowed, the more money the Fed created. And the more money it created, the more the economy grew, fueled not by production, but by promises. Infinite money sounds powerful, until you see who pays the interest. Interest is one of the quietest forces in the world, silent, invisible, relentless. It doesn't march in the streets, it doesn't make headlines, it doesn't announce itself. But every year, it moves trillions of dollars upward. When governments borrow, they don't repay the principal. They simply pay interest year after year, generation after generation. And where does that money come from? From you. From your taxes? From every paycheck, every purchase, every hidden surcharge and fee that fills the government's revenue stream. Imagine a giant funnel placed above the entire population. At the top sit pension funds, major banks, insurance companies, and global asset managers institutions holding government bonds. At the bottom sit millions of ordinary workers. Every year, money flows upward through this funnel, quietly, constantly, predictably. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It doesn't matter which party is in power. Interest must be paid. The institutions holding the debt become richer, stronger, more untouchable. The taxpayers footing the bill remain unaware that their money isn't building roads or schools, it's maintaining a financial loop that never ends. And this works fine until a nation can't even pay the interest. But what happens when nations themselves can't pay? By the late 1970s, inflation in the United States was spiraling out of control. Prices soared, confidence collapsed. The dollar, the backbone of global finance, was losing credibility. And into this storm stepped a man whose decisions would shake not only America, but the entire developing world. Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker had one goal: crush inflation. And he was willing to use the most brutal tool in the economic arsenal to do it. He raised interest rates. Not slightly, not cautiously, but to levels no modern nation had ever seen. The federal funds rate shot to 20%, sending shockwaves through every economy tied to the dollar. For America, it triggered a deep recession. But for developing nations, countries that had borrowed billions in dollar-denominated loans during the 1970s, it was catastrophic. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil $60 billion. Argentina $40 billion. And suddenly, overnight, their interest payments tripled. These nations could no longer breathe. Their export earnings weren't enough to service the debt. Default loomed. Panic spread through the global banking system. Volcker had a choice. Let countries default, or build something new. He chose the latter. Through the International Monetary Fund, the U.S., and major banks created a new system, one that didn't forgive debt, but restructured it, extending the life of the loan and ensuring interest continued to flow. This wasn't relief. This wasn't mercy. This was surrender economic sovereignty traded in exchange for survival. This wasn't forgiveness, it was surrender. When the IMF arrived in a struggling nation, it did not come as a savior, it came as a negotiator, and the negotiation was always the same. We will lend you the money you need to survive, but you must change everything. These were the infamous structural adjustment programs. Governments were ordered to slash public spending, cut subsidies, privatize state industries, open markets to foreign companies, devalue their currencies, and remove protections that once shielded their citizens from global volatility. In theory, these reforms would stabilize the economy. In reality, they transferred power. Assets once owned by the public utilities, railways, mines, ports, were sold to foreign investors at bargain prices. Domestic industries collapsed under new competition. Essential services shrank. Poverty surged. Entire nations became dependent on loans just to keep basic systems functioning. But the most important consequence wasn't economic. It was political. A country that needs IMF approval cannot chart its own future. It cannot make independent policy. It cannot escape the system that saved it, and then claimed its autonomy as the price. Because in global finance, debt isn't just a burden, it's leverage. A country in debt is a country without choices. For centuries, nations borrowed from merchants, banks, and foreign powers. But today, something far stranger and far more dangerous has emerged. A circular system where everyone owes everyone, and no country can afford for another to fall. Japan holds more than $1 trillion in US debt. China holds hundreds of billions. The United States, through the IMF and World Bank, indirectly holds the debts of dozens of developing nations. European banks hold emerging market bonds. Emerging markets hold European debt. Saudi Arabia funds America's deficits. America's consumers fund China's exports. And China's savings in turn help fund the governments of Europe. The modern world has become a single, interlocking financial organism, each nation a vital organ, each bond a fragile artery. If one government defaults, the shock does not stay contained. It spreads. Through banks, through pension funds, through currencies, through trade routes, through markets that operate faster than any political response. This is the final evolution of the debt system that began in 1694. No country is allowed to fail. No country is allowed to reset. No country is allowed to walk away. Because a default in one capital could collapse markets in another, before the sun even rises. And here's the trap. No one can default without sinking the whole system. For most people, debt feels like something you should eventually pay off. A mortgage ends. A car loan ends. A credit card balance, if you're lucky, ends. So it's natural to assume governments should do the same, work hard, grow their economies, and one day eliminate their national debt. But that belief collapses the moment you understand a single truth. Debt is the source of modern money. When the government borrows, the central bank creates new money to buy its bonds. Those bonds enter the financial system as assets. Investors trade them, banks use them as collateral, pension funds store them as savings. Debt becomes the backbone of the entire monetary supply. If the US suddenly paid off its $38 trillion debt, those bonds would disappear, and the money created through them would vanish. Trillions of dollars erased overnight. Banks starved of collateral, markets drained of liquidity. The global money supply shrinks so violently that the economy collapses under its own weight. This is why no major country has ever paid off its debt. Not once. Not in centuries. Because paying off debt isn't responsible. In the modern system, it's impossible. Debt cannot disappear without destroying the currency built on top of it. So, if debt can't disappear, what happens next? If Patterson built the foundation, Rothschild scaled it, Morgan centralized it, and Volcker globalized it, then today's architects didn't inherit the system. They optimized it. In the modern world, true financial power doesn't sit with kings or even governments. It sits with institutions so vast, so intertwined with global markets, that their influence is almost invisible because it's everywhere. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, the triad of asset managers that collectively control tens of trillions of dollars, quietly holding pieces of nearly every major corporation and, more importantly, immense quantities of government debt. These institutions don't just buy bonds. They recycle them, leverage them, use them to build investment products that feed retirement accounts, insurance portfolios, and sovereign wealth funds. Every dollar of government debt becomes raw material for financial machinery that now touches almost every household on Earth, whether you know it or not. And here's the part no politician ever mentions. When governments pay interest, it flows into these institutions, not as charity, not as profit, but as a structural feature of the global economy, a continuous river of money moving upward from taxpayers to the financial apex. Your interest payments feed their balance sheets. Your taxes stabilize their portfolios. Your currency relies on the debt they hold. The empire didn't vanish. It scaled. Across 3 centuries, the world has changed, empires fallen, technologies invented, borders redrawn. But beneath all the noise, beneath all the headlines, a single pattern has repeated with mathematical precision. Crisis. Innovation. Control. Patterson saw a monarchy drowning in war debt, and he created permanent national borrowing. Rothschild saw fragmented European finance, and he built a global bond network no nation could escape. Morgan saw a fragile American banking system, and he engineered a central authority disguised as decentralization. Volcker saw inflation threatening the dollar, and he used global debt restructuring to bind countries to a new financial order. Different centuries, different problems, same outcome. Each architect didn't replace the last. They stacked their solutions on top of one another, turning temporary responses into permanent structures. What began as a patch for England became the architecture of the modern world. And now, today's financial giants BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street operate on top of that layered system, scaling it to a size none of the architects could have imagined. Every era added a new layer. Every crisis tightened the design. every solution reduced the chance of escape. Because once you understand the pattern, everything becomes horrifyingly clear. The pattern is repeating again. If the world is built on debt that can never be repaid, then what happens when the system begins to strain, when interest grows faster than economies, when currencies weaken, when nations run out of room to borrow? The future doesn't offer escape. It offers three paths, each one shaped by the same machine that created the crisis. The first path is inflation, a quiet, invisible tax that lowers the value of your money without ever appearing on a ballot. Governments won't say they're raising taxes. They'll simply print more money, letting prices rise while your income stays the same. You pay the debt through the slow erosion of your savings. The second path is the Great Reset. Not forgiveness, not liberation, but a restructuring of global debt wrapped in comforting language like stability, reform, or international cooperation. Old loans will be replaced with new ones. Debtors will breathe for a moment, only to be trapped again under different terms. A reset that resets nothing. The third path is digital control, central bank digital currencies, programmable money. A system where every transaction can be traced, limited, or denied. Debt becomes easier to expand, easier to enforce, and harder than ever to escape. A financial seatbelt that looks safe until you realize it locks from the outside. Different futures, different mechanisms, same outcome. But none of these futures include escape. Most people move through life without ever noticing the machinery around them. They work, they earn, they spend, they save believing they're participating in a system designed for their benefit. A system shaped by democracy, guided by leaders, accountable to the public. But once you trace the flow of money, once you follow the incentives, once you see who gains and who pays, the illusion collapses. Because the truth is simple. You were born inside a machine that was built long before you existed. A machine that allocates wealth upward. A machine that converts your labor into interest. A machine that uses debt not as a tool, but as a leash. You cannot vote it away. You cannot protest it away. You cannot work your way out of it. But you can understand it. And that is the first step toward navigating it, toward protecting yourself from the traps that consume nations, toward making choices that sidestep the mechanisms designed to keep you compliant. Knowledge doesn't free you from the system, but it stops the system from owning your mind. Because once you see the machine, you can't unsee it. For more than 3 centuries, the world has operated on a design most people never notice. A design built piece by piece, crisis by crisis, architect by architect. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global, Morgan made it infinite, Volcker made it inescapable. And today's financial giants have scaled it into something so vast, so silent, so deeply embedded into daily life that escaping it isn't just difficult, it's impossible. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't the result of one policy, one election, or one generation. It was a system refined by time. A system that rewards those who understand it and punishes those who don't. A system where governments live on borrowed money, where taxpayers fund interest they never agreed to, and where wealth flows steadily toward the institutions that hold the world's debt. You may not have chosen this world. You may not benefit from it. But you're living in it every day, every purchase, every paycheck. And the least they owe you is the truth. If you want to understand the mechanisms that shape your life, the hidden levers, the historical patterns, the financial forces no school will ever teach you, then subscribe. Because this system was built without your permission, but the knowledge to navigate it is yours.